We're going to continue our conversation regarding International Mechanical Code looking at Chapter 3. Now Chapter 3 is an overview chapter of the entire remainder of the code. Chapter 3 covers general regulations. These regulations govern everything having to do with any type of appliance. It doesn't matter if it's in a later section. The later sections will add to this section. Section 301 again is general, just like any other chapter. It tells you the scope of the chapter. It tells you about energy utilization. It tells you about listed and labeled. It tells you about personal, independent, and other types of equipment. It talks about vibration isolation, and then it goes on to talk about rodent proofing and seismic resistance. Section 302 is protection of the structure. We need to make sure that anything the equipment is installed with is safe. Penetrations of floor and ceiling, cutting and notching of wood framing, board holes. Talks about alteration to trusses, and it talks about self-steel framing. Okay, we need to make sure that we never take away enough material that it makes the structure unsafe. Section 303 talks about equipment appliance location. You can't put fuel-fired appliances, for example, in sleeping rooms, bathrooms, toilet rooms, storage closets, and surgical rooms. You need to be very aware of where fossil fuel appliances are. It needs to be in safe position. That is a really important section of the code. Section 304 talks about the installation of equipment. It talks about the conflicts between International Mechanical Code and the manufacturer's instructions. Okay, the provisions of this code override manufacturer's installation instructions. Section 305 talks about piping support. All mechanical piping shall be supported in accordance with this section. You can't just hang piping and hang it however you want. It talks about the proper materials. It talks about the piping hangers that are in contact with piping. We cannot have galvanic actions. Table 305.4 is a table you will need to refer to both in the field and when you're taking your licensing exams. Very specifically, you need to understand the difference between copper alloy tubing, copper alloy pipe, and the different sizes of tubing and pipe. They have different code requirements. Horizontal spacing is, for example, when the tubing is running across the top of the basement ceiling. Vertical spacing is when you're running between floors. Section 306 talks about the access and the service space. You got to be able to get in there and service things. You need to understand that furnaces have to have space around them. Air conditioners have to have space around them. You got to be able to get to them. Section 307 talks about condensate disposal. What happens with the water that's condensed out of furnace exhaust? What happens for the water that is condensed when you have a cooling coil? Where does it go? Section 308 talks about reduced clearance, like for combustible materials. This is the space between a fossil fuel burning appliance and the surrounding walls or structure. How can you reduce the clearance? Section 306 talks about all the materials you can use. On the table here, talks about all the materials you can use to reduce clearance. Section 309 talks about temperature control. 309.1 talks about space heating systems. Okay, they have to have a minimum indoor temperature of 68 degrees at a point 3 feet above the board on the design heating day. Design heating day means what the building is required to contain. For example, in this area we might design our building for a minimum temperature of 5 degrees. We have to maintain 68 degrees. And you cannot use, per code, you cannot use portable space heaters to maintain compliance. You have to, in section 310 we talk about explosion control. In 311 we talk about smoke and heat vents. 312 is talked about load, heating and load calculations. Okay, very important now. Load calculations must be done in accordance with ASHRAE Heat Handbook of Fundamentals. It is required that it has to be taken care of with International Energy Conservation Codes, Chapter 3. So again, Chapter 3 is important because it provides a basis for all common things like piping, um, preventive combustible materials, installation, that is going to be found in the following chapters. So now what I need you to do is go back through, read Chapter 3, and find the important points of Chapter 3 and participate in the discussion boards in this lesson.